Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, my dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to the episode. This is the Juba man Surah Yusuf, and let's just dive into this. Now I know a lot of you guys love your Shakespeare, your J.K. Rowling, your Roald Dahl, your Edgar Allan Poe, and so on and so forth, and you think it's the best thing in the world, the best thing in the world. I'm about to burst your bubble.
ريض يا الطارش يلم عنا خط بكتابك بترحيبك لو سرابك ليلك وجنة بالدجا في الليل تسريبك.
If you've studied literature, or if you've taken Shakespeare in class, your teacher probably used large words that you didn't even understand, and all you did was... Unfortunately, that's what we'll be discussing today. 3 storytelling devices we study are foreshadowing, allegory, contrast, and comparison. Now what is foreshadowing? To explain foreshadowing to you in a simple way, I'll give you an example. Now I know for a fact that everyone has watched the movie Home Alone. And if you haven't, you probably live under a table. It's a movie about a little boy, and in the beginning of the movie, this is what happens.
I don't want to see you again for the rest of my whole life, and I don't want to see anybody else either.
I hope you don't mean that. You'd feel pretty sad if you woke up tomorrow morning and you didn't have a family.
No, I wouldn't.
Then say it again. Maybe it'll happen.
I hope I never see any of you jerks again.
Now, on the next day, surprisingly, this is what happens.
We made it.
Can you believe it? Hope we didn't forget anything.
Now the simplest definition for foreshadowing you can find is when a writer uses the actions and sayings of the characters to hint towards a possible future event. Now let's take an example of foreshadowing from Macbeth. In this well-known Shakespearean play, there's a nobleman called Macbeth, who later becomes the king. In the middle of the story, Macbeth searches for these 3 witches, and when he finds them, this is what they say to him. "You shall rule until Burnham Wood approaches Dunsinane Hill." And guess what? Macbeth's rule does come to an end. And do you know when that happens? That happens when Burnham Wood approaches Dunsinane Hill. Now, just to give you a bit more information on how this happens, Burnham Wood is a forest, Dunsinane Hill is a hill. Now, literally that would mean Burnham Wood would have to walk, the trees would have to move towards the hill. Oh my god! You're probably wondering how a forest moves towards a hill. Teacher, me, teacher, me. I'll explain how. As the army is passing through Burnham Wood, they pick up branches from the trees to camouflage themselves and walk towards Dunsinane Hill. This appears as if the forest is moving towards Dunsinane Hill. And this is how foreshadowing is used to tell part of the story in Macbeth. Now let me give you an example of foreshadowing from Surah Yusuf. In the beginning of Surah Yusuf, Yusuf a.s. tells his father about his dream. His father Yaqub a.s. replies to him and says, "I fear that your brothers will plot against you." And guess what happened? They plot against him. Later on in the story, when the brothers of Hazrat Yusuf are plotting against him, they gather around and talk among themselves. They say, "Let's kill Yusuf a.s." One of them says, "Don't kill Yusuf, throw him in a well. A caravan might pick him up." When they execute their plan and throw Hazrat Yusuf inside the well, they leave him, and after a while, remember this is in the barren desert where no caravan ever comes, nothing passes by, it's barren, there's no animals, nothing. But guess what? A caravan does pick him up. In the same part of the story, when Hazrat Yusuf's brothers ask their father, Hazrat Yaqub, if they can take Hazrat Yusuf out to play with them, and he says, "I'm afraid a wolf might eat him." And guess what excuse they give their father? As expected, a wolf ate him. So as you can see, the story of Yusuf a.s. also uses foreshadowing. Contrast and comparison is a rhetorical device where the writer examines the similarities and or differences between 2 people, ideas, places, or things. In classical English literature, we're given the example of one of Charles Dickens' finest books, The Tale of Two Cities. While beginning the book, he writes, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. You see what he did there? There's so much contrast and comparison in that paragraph. He keeps on comparing the different lifestyles between France and England. Now let's take some examples of contrast and comparison from Surah Yusuf. Oh my god! Surah Yusuf also has contrast and comparison? Of course it does. The example of contrast and comparison in Surah Yusuf comes when the brothers of Hazrat Yusuf gather around and discuss their younger brothers. This happens 2 times in the story. The first time, they are planning to plot against their younger brother, that is Hazrat Yusuf a.s. The second time, they're planning to help their younger brother, Benjamin or Benjamin. The comparison in this situation is when the brothers gather together. The contrast is their different motives at each gathering. Another contrast and comparison in Surah Yusuf is when Yusuf a.s. is conspired against twice. As a result of both conspiracies, he ends up in a dark place. The first dark place was the well, the second dark place was the jail. When he comes out of the first dark place, he becomes a slave, which is a state of powerlessness. However, when he comes out of the second dark place, he becomes a ruler, which is a state of powerfulness. The comparison being made is that Hazrat Yusuf is conspired against twice, and each time he ends up in a dark place. The contrast is the outcome of his going to this dark place. A lesson can be learned from this, that your situation can be the same, but the outcome always depends on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course. The third storytelling device is called allegory. Allegory is defined as extending a metaphor throughout a narrative to give a larger meaning. After World War II, a story was published. The story style was called Terrible Things. Now this story was an allegory of the German Holocaust. The story is set in a forest. In this forest there are many different kinds of animals, and they're all living peacefully together. However, one day, these things called terrible things show up inside the forest, and they take away the birds. The rest of the animals, they give the terrible things the birds without any resistance. Now the next time the terrible things come, they ask for the fish. Now everyone gives in to their demands, and this happens a lot of times. And each time they try to justify the terrible thing's action. They say this animal was stupid, this animal was noisy, this animal was smelly, and so on and so forth. In the end, only the rabbits remain. And then the rabbits begin to wonder why they didn't help the other animals when they were in danger. Now this is an allegory of the German Holocaust. Now you're probably wondering, how is this related to the German Holocaust? Now during the German Holocaust, this is what happened. First the Nazis, they came for the Jews. And if you weren't Jewish, it didn't concern you. Next they came for the Gypsies. And if you weren't Gypsy or Jewish, then it didn't concern you. Then they came for the communists and trade unionists and the Catholics and so on and so forth. Each time they took someone, nobody else cared unless they were inside that group. Now you might be wondering, what allegory is there in Surah Yusuf? Now if you read the 4th verse of Surah Yusuf, the Prophet Yusuf a.s. he tells his father about his dream. He says, I saw 11 stars, the sun and the moon, prostrating themselves before me. Now this is an allegory. If you read it in the Arabic language, and also if you read the English translation, you'll see it appears as if it's different, it's separate from the story, right? Well, you might be saying, well, that's not really an allegory, it's not extended throughout the whole narrative. However, this is the beauty of Surah Yusuf. An allegory is given in the 4th verse, and the rest of the story is an explanation of how that allegory comes to be. SubhanAllah, we just proved how Surah Yusuf poses a formidable challenge to the so-called masterpieces of English literature in terms of storytelling. And every storytelling device used in their so-called classics was undoubtedly present in this one single chapter of the Holy Quran entitled Surah Yusuf. However, that's not all. Surah Yusuf has something much greater in terms of his storytelling, something that will shock you, something that no story has ever been able to do and no story will ever be able to challenge. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that this is the best story of all time. So my dear brothers and sisters, I leave you with that, and don't forget to share, like and subscribe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.